Recently, I spoke about the allegations the BBC is facing regarding anti-Israel bias. Um, Now, I'm going to read out a bit of a report from the Times, not the whole thing, because I want to cover all the things in this video. But just a few disclaimers before I get into this. Just to get it out there, I have some degree of sympathy with the BBC because honestly, I think when it comes to Israel and Gaza and Israel and other conflicts, the BBC is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. I think it's always going to get criticised by someone as the state broadcaster. Um, I myself was critical of the BBC. I still am regarding their attitude to designating Hamas a terrorist organization, or more accurately, calling Hamas a terrorist organization. That is actually the legal definition. It's not just a word thrown around, it's a legal definition in British law, and it is how the British, American, and other Western governments regard Hamas, not just Israel. As a state broadcaster, I think the BBC should reflect that. But more importantly, it's not consistent to their own record because they've had no problem calling out terrorism on other occasions. For example, the Christchurch terrorist attack in 2019, they called that a terrorist attack. So their explanation that it's a loaded term and that's why they're reluctant to use it, I don't really think it stands up. That having been said, for all those who say the BBC is anti-Israel, there are just as many people who say it's too pro-Israel, which to me suggests it really cannot win. It's going to be condemned no matter what approach it takes. I also think that there is no conflict in the world as polarizing as this one. Even Ukraine, which attracts a lot of debate, there's no conflict like that between Israel and its enemies, for want of a better term, because at the moment it's fighting a war on at least three fronts. I mean, for example, if we look at all the wars going on in the world, really, you don't get large demonstrations over the war in Sudan. It's probably led to more deaths than the war between Israel and Gaza in the last year, but it gets some media focus, but you don't see mass rallies. And frankly, people just don't care as much. They don't care unless they're part of the Sudanese diaspora or perhaps from some of the surrounding countries. But it just doesn't galvanize interest in the same way. Or the numerous bloody jihadist insurgencies going on in West Africa, or the very costly war in Burma. I mean, that will be a big issue, granted, in that region, but no conflict that's going on in the world right now gets the same level of polarization as that between Israel and its neighbors. And that in itself is an important point because when broadcasters and publications weigh into it, they'll inevitably be charged of bias one way or the other. I think it is genuinely very, very difficult to get the right level of impartiality. But there's another point that has to be considered. Impartiality doesn't mean that it's going to be 50-50 coverage. I mean, in the case of the war that's going on in the Near East, we know that October the 7th, that dreadful day, there were hundreds of Israeli civilian casualties. Of the 1,200 people killed, most of them were civilians. But since then, thousands upon thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed. And so far, just in the last week, at least 700 Lebanese civilians. So when the BBC is accused of bias, you have to factor in things like this, where inevitably there's going to be more focus on a particular area. Um, I have seen BBC reports showing the damage from Hezbollah rocket attacks and the displacement of Israeli civilians. So that's important. I also saw an interview where there were a BBC journalist was interviewing a Hamas terrorist, and the guy walked out of the interview because he didn't like the line of questioning, because the journalist was challenging him on the targeting of civilians. So this idea, I've heard people say, for example, the BBC is pro-Hamas. That's absurd. I don't like the way they refuse to call Hamas a terrorist group, but that doesn't mean it's pro-Hamas. And actually saying so could potentially endanger journalists. Um, I think when you look at other publications, like the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, they're fiercely pro-Israel. You're not going to get unbiased coverage there. Al Jazeera is going to be very anti-Israel, right? The Guardian's going to be anti-Israel in its overall outlook. So when you compare the BBC to other publications, other media outlets, I think it is probably the most balanced you'll find. And it's not perfect. It's far from perfect. Now, in the report that was compiled by Danny Cohen, who was a director of television at the BBC from 2013 to 2015, this apparently used research from the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, a group founded in 1982 to challenge what are called general anti-Israel bias. So this group itself is pro-Israel. It's coming in with an agenda of proving the BBC and other outlets are anti-Israel. And that's not to say that they're wrong, but they themselves are not neutral. Let's be very clear about that. They're not impartial. They're not neutral. They are explicitly pro-Israel. That's an important point. Anyway, one of the things they cited was, well, I'll just read out this little bit. Let's see, in part, general anti-Israel bias in parts of the US press at that time. It said that the BBC had admitted to some isolated mistakes in its coverage, but added this report catalogues many of those isolated mistakes in one place for the first time. In one example, it criticised the broadcaster for using the term revenge attacks in a headline about Israel's response to the attacks of October the 7th on the day itself, claiming that this portrayed Israel as a vengeful aggressor. I think when you have an ongoing situation, and this is an escalating situation, there's more developments every day. I think sometimes in a busy newsroom, there can be mistakes made. Um, but Cohen and Baroness Deitch in the forward, Baroness Deitch was a BBC governor from 2002 to 2006, said honest mistakes can be made in war reporting, but added the mistakes are almost always in the anti-Israel direction. It would not be possible to compile a similar report of anti-Palestinian errors. Yet you get a lot of pro-Palestinians who also condemn the BBC. This is the thing. The BBC is attacked from the other side. The Centre for Media Monitoring, set up by the Muslim Council of Britain, published its own report in March. It listed examples where it accused the BBC of failing to properly challenge Israeli claims about the war, of using more emotive terms to describe Israeli compared with Palestinian casualties, and of devoting more coverage to anti-Semitism than to Islamophobia. David Jordan, the BBC Director of Editorial Policy, told MPs at the time that complaints were evenly split, noting we had just under 4,000 people complaining that our coverage was biased against Israel, and had over 4,000 complaining that it was biased in favour of Israel. The latest report states, whenever the corporation is faced with the choice of whose account or narrative to believe, it seldom points in Israel's direction. A BBC spokeswoman said the Israel-Gaza conflict is a polarising and difficult story to cover, and we understand that there are a range of views. The BBC has focused on reporting the conflict impartially, bringing audiences breaking news, insight and analysis, and reflecting all perspectives. While we do not recognise the overall characterisation of our journalism in this report, we will of course always look at anything raised with us with care and attention. Now, in the letter section, some of those complaining say that the BBC is being too defensive and in denial of these things, but surely the BBC has a right to defend itself. I mean, the thing I think is notable about this is I'm not saying that they're wrong in the allegations of bias, but I would point out that they themselves are biased. Now, with all due respect to Mr. Cohen and the others, they are coming at this with an agenda of proving the BBC's bias against Israel. And in that context, they are very pro-Israel. So they're not an independent source. They're not an independent critic. It's not like they represent Israelis and Palestinians. They're pro-Israel. That's an important point because it suggests to me that what they really want, they're saying impartiality. I think what they really want, honestly, is just pro-Israel coverage. I mean, you'll get situations, for example, if an entire family is wiped out in an Israeli airstrike, the BBC covers that. That cannot be taken in of itself to be anti-Israel. It's just facts on the ground. That is the job of journalists, to report the truth. The job of journalists has never been to take one side or another, or to the issue about impartiality is is also flawed because people seem to think it means 50-50 coverage. Impartiality means not going in with an agenda in favor of one side or the other. It doesn't mean 50-50 coverage because in this conflict, we know that the vast majority of casualties are those that Israel has been fighting against. Many of them civilians. So, for example, over 700 Israeli civilians have been killed. That's out of the about 1,300 in total. Um, but thousands upon thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed. So inevitably, there's going to be focus of that. And quite frankly, I would trust someone like Orla Guerin a lot more than I would trust an IDF spokesperson or a really right-wing pro-Israeli living in London or Brooklyn. I'm not saying that there's no merit to the claims. I'm not saying that there aren't examples of poor coverage, but I do question the motivation. If they're coming at this from a pro Israel perspective, then it follows that they want just pro Israel coverage. Because I don't see any caveat saying we're not saying the BBC cannot criticize Israel or have critical coverage. Um, I mean, journalists are going to, I do sympathize with journalists because they're going to be condemned no matter what they do. And apparently it's had an effect on their mental health. You know, when they're being bombarded with abuse, being labeled pro-terrorist, pro-Hamas, constantly vilified, that is going to start to have an effect on people's mental health. It's not a trivial thing. It could even potentially endanger journalists on the ground. Um, so more broadly, I think, you know, anyone who takes a position on this is going to be accused one way or another. Anyone who tries to show a moral consistency. An example is the Australian human rights activist Drew Pavlo. Now, he has been very consistent in his condemnation of Hezbollah and Hamas. He's also been critical of Israel, yet he's been attacked by both sides. Uh, I'm less prominent than Drew Pavlo, but I found myself in a similar position because, you know, after October the 7th, I was obviously, like any normal person, I condemned Hamas for their brutal terrorist attack. Um, but when I've criticized Israel, I've been accused of being a leftist and a pro Hamas. I think far too much of, you know, you see the black and white duality of thinking in this conflict, and it's not black and white.